Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining and for tuning in. We're gonna wait a couple of minutes and we're gonna start after that just to have people come and join us. I hope everyone's doing well. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. So I think for most of us here, it's good morning, except for those in Europe, it's the evening for us. So, all right. Hi, Joria.
Hello.
Okay. All right, I see Brad. Okay. Hi, Z. Okay. Oh, Bahar is here as well. Nice. Hi, Bahar. Okay.
Hi, Karen. Hi, Sarah. Good luck, and I'm sure you do amazing.
Thank you. We've been missing you. You need to come back.
We'll do someday.
Yeah, so once this is over, we need to meet again.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah, but I've been like keeping up with all your presentations. They've been like really great. I'm a huge fan of your work.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to this workshop. I'm sure it's going to be amazing.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm off.
Okay. All right, 2 more minutes and we start because I see that there are still people coming in. All right, so I guess we can start and then have a nice introduction. And then meanwhile, I think for those who still want to join, they can hop in. I know it's pretty early in the morning for some. So hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. This is the second edition of our workshop, Solutions for Socially Intelligent HRI in Real-World Scenarios. A little background about the workshop and why we started it. We actually met Professor Brad at a school in Japan, and we thought that there was an interest in bringing together researchers from either Europe or the US, and mostly researchers from the industry and researchers from academia, because there's a lot to discuss and to talk about. And we found that there were a lot of common goals and problems that we're trying to solve. So we thought, why not make it a workshop and bring people together. We actually started it as a school at SoftBank Robotics. So we had about 15 PhD students and researchers come. It was a week long, and then after after that, we launched the workshop series. The first one was in Roma, back. So that was interesting. I mean, I would have loved if it was physical, but it was virtual and it was still great. And so we thought we would do it again, especially since that time HRI was supposed to be in Colorado. And so I'm not alone doing this. So a bit about me. My name is Dr.Tathagata. I'm a robotics researcher and PhD candidate at Sorbonne University. I'm also a Marie Curie fellow in an ITN project called Animatas. With me is Sarah as well. And Akib, who you're going to hear from in a bit. Marine is also here. She's a engineering manager at SoftBank Robotics, and Professor Brad, who's also a professor at Boulder, the University of Boulder, Colorado. So you see that half of us are in Europe, half of us is in the US. So this has been kind of living in 2 time zones, especially with virtual conferences. So we're really excited for today, this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. We have 2 great speakers, and we also have a PhD Spotlight series where there will be certain presentations from PhD students. If you can stick around for that, it's going to be fast presentations where each PhD student is going to spotlight their work in 10 minutes or raise a research question. And it's a way for us to kind of get to discuss our work in a very informal way, because we felt that with virtual conferences, it's been a bit tough to do that. So do stick around. This is going to be interesting. And I will give the floor to Akib to present our first keynote speaker.
Thanks, Karen, for the introduction, and everyone. Let me get into the introduction for the current keynote speaker. So first of all, I'm Akib Tabriz, and it is my immense pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Tathagata Chakraborti. Dr. Tathagata did his PhD thesis with Dr. Subaru Kambampati on Foundation of Human-Aware Planning, a tale of 3 models. He has numerous awards and accolades with him, to mention few. He has won IBM PhD fellowship from 2016 to 2018. He was awarded ICAP's People's Choice Best Systems Demonstration Award in 2020, and he was named AI's 10 to watch out for. And currently he is working with IBM Research AI in AI Composition Lab. We are really excited to have him. And without any further ado, I'll let Dr. Tathagata have the stage.
Thank you, Akib, for the kind intro. Thank you for inviting me as well. Happy Friday, everyone. Hope you had a great HRI. I'm going to share my screen. All right, you can see it, right? All right. So today, I'll be talking about the many different flavors of interpretable agent behavior and how to go about thinking of all these different considerations while designing an agent that can work with humans in the loop. And I guess the big takeaway from this talk will be of thinking of the model of the human explicitly in the decision making of a robot, and how that impacts the classical notions of decision making. And feel free to stop me at any time if you have questions, and we can make this more interactive as well. So, okay, so I mean, coming from the HRI background, this is what we do. We have a human and we have a robot, and the model M here is meant to represent the decision-making model of the robot. So everything that goes into making a decision, the robot's understanding of the world, the capabilities of the robot, its goals, and so on. So so whenever I mention a model, think of all them taken together. Given the model, you're trying to make decisions of how to act in the world and interface with the human in the loop. Now, as you know, humans always come with expectations, if you are, if in a human-human interaction, these expectations are sort of well understood because we are all humans. And of course, they get refined over time, but we more or less know how to work with each other. But that's not usually the case with robots because robots are not humans, and every robot is different. They have many internal constraints that end users don't know about. And so usually in the same way as you get in human-human interactions, you have to deal with, you as the robot have to deal with the expectations of the humans. And these expectations are not often aligned because the differences between robots and humans. And so, so the first key takeaway that I will elaborate a lot more during the talk is that if you are trying to be interpretable to the human in the loop and interpretable in the general sense, and we will dive deeper into that. The key aspect to keep in mind is that to understand what the mental model of the human in the loop is and how to navigate that. So to understand what the implications of having a user model, how it impacts behavior, and how to explicitly deal with the implications of that model. So, so for the rest of the talk, I will be talking about these, the mental model of the human as MRH, and this is an expectation of what the human has in mind. Of course, we don't have access to what the human has in mind. So I will use the same notation for both as a proxy. So unless otherwise mentioned, it's an expectation over what the robot thinks the human expects. And so, so when I mentioned the implications of having such a model, you could think of many different ways it might impact the observer, right? So they can go like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. It's when the models are not aligned. The robot might be doing very reasonable things in the robot model, but because the models are not aligned, even the best thing that the robot can do might not make sense to the human because it's being evaluated by a mental model. And of course, these models are not maybe uncertain, right? So the human may not have complete knowledge of what the robot is up to, which might mean they have ambiguity over the goals they're trying to achieve, or ambiguity over the plan that they're going to execute, what the next steps are, and so on. So the having a misalignment between the ground truth model and the model of the human in the loop can manifest itself in many different ways. And so in literature, you would find three broad classes of dealing with these situations. So you have, when expectations differ, you have this idea of producing explicable plans. So these are plans that are close or same as what the human would expect. So effectively, you are being suboptimal in your own model in order to conform to expectations. So that's the first one. You also have legible behavior, where you're trying to communicate implicitly what some hidden model parameter is by means of your behavior. So, so one model parameter might be the goals. And if you think that the human doesn't know your goals uniquely, or they have confusion over what you're trying to achieve, then you can modify your behavior so as to make it clearer what exactly you're trying to do. And sort of similar to that, you have predictability of behavior as well, where it's the same thing as legibility, but with the behavior itself and not the model. So if you have many possible plans that you could achieve, and there's uncertain, it's impossible to tell from the observer's point of view which one it is, then you can change your behavior to emphasize one over the other. And so the general idea in all three of these types of behaviors is that you are changing your behavior in order to maximize some notion of interpretability, whether it's your underlying model or your goals or your plans and so on. And as with any notion of interpretability, there's a counterpart to all of these in direct or explicit communication. So instead of changing your behavior to implicitly maximize these notions, you can always explain to the end user like why you did something, why that is different from what the expectation was in terms of those differences in the underlying models, and in general communicate information about the model and the plan that you're working with. So sort of changing behavior or implicit communication is sort of the other side of the coin for explicit communication. And the interesting part of this is that each of these notions of interpretability map to some underlying abduction process of the observer. So you could think of the explanation process, you could think of goal recognition, you could think of plan recognition. All of these abduction processes are individually interesting from the observer's point of view. And there's a lot of literature on each of these, what this means from the observer's point of view. The interesting part is here we are considering the abduction process of the observers inside the decision-making model of the agent itself. And by virtue of doing that, we want to make sure that the human knows what's going on in the broadest of terms and interact with them more effectively. So here's a very, very minimalistic example of what these look like. So as I said, legibility is revealing some model parameters. So it might be, in the general case, it's just, let's say, well, in this specific case, it's a goals, like where it wants to be. And as you can see with the greener path, you will realize that this is the possible goal. Whereas if you go straight up, then there are multiple possible goals that you could be achieving. So just by virtue of taking a right turn early, you have implicitly signaled that you're going for the goal on the right. Similarly, for explicable behavior, if there's a constraint of the robot that it can't go near the walls, then only the first one works, and doing the other one is costlier. Similarly, for predictability, if you're going for the specific goal, there are many ways to get there, but only one of them resolves the path early. So if you take a right turn, the observer knows that this is the rest of the plan. Well, and one thing to note between the one on the left and one on the right is that they are both trying to reduce the uncertainty, but one of them is again over the model. So it's trying to signal the goal, while the other one is trying to signal the plan. And the interesting bit there is that even if the entire model is aligned, the plans may not be immediately predictable. So because there are many possible plans given a model. In general, the way to produce this sort of behavior is to basically change the underlying cost structure of the decision-making problem. So if you think of, let's say, search for planning problems, it's usually done through what's called a heuristic search or informed search. And the point of informed search is that as you're searching, the heuristic is providing information on how far you're away from goal. And so that way you compute the shortest or quickest plans. In the classical sense, that's the only constraint, like find the shortest plan or the best plan. One of the ways of changing that is to change the guidance to a function that captures what the expectations are. So instead of computing paths that are biased towards the goal only, you're computing plans that are, in a sense, known to be more explicable. And I won't really go into the gory details of this. This is just one way to compute it. But the key thing here to keep in mind is that you can't use the mental model directly to make plans. And the reason for that is that the expectations might be way off what's actually possible. And so you don't want to do the use the model directly, but you want to make sure that you have a way of folding that information into the search. So that sort of is a very quick overview of what the three different notions of interpretability are. It turns out, well, before we go into the communication bit, one thing to note here is that we have taken these three things separately so far, right? So, and we will come back later and see that that's not usually enough to model these behaviors. But before we get there, the other side of the coin, we said that we could either change our behavior or we could communicate. Right? So the first one on the communication side of things is explanations. So explanations are usually when models are not aligned, and so the human asks like, why this plan, or why not this other plan, and you're trying to negate some foil that the human has come up with. So any alternative that the human or the explainee has presented as a possible decision is called a foil. And so the point of an explanation is to negate all possible foils. And so one of the ways that we think about this explanation process is one of what we call model reconciliation. And the idea being that if the models align, then decisions align. So the root cause of an explanation is that there is a mismatch in the mental model versus the ground truth model. And so the process of explanation becomes one of reconciling those differences. And the way to go about this is what we call model space search. And what's going on here is that given your expectation of where the human model is and where your own model is, you're trying to search in the space of differences and trying to come up with a set of model differences, which when you point out to the human, the decision that you made would be same as what they would come up with. So the explanation is a model update, and the effect of doing that model update is that both the robot and the human comes up with the same decision. And there are many interesting things to explore within this this notion of model space search. The idea of minimality, like what's the minimum amount of information that I need to tell the human, or like what's the shortest explanation. There's a notion of monotonicity as well, like how much of the model should you reveal so that the explanation never becomes false later on. It turns out that the more model updates you give, previous explanations can in fact become invalid. So there are ways to make sure that that never happens. Of course, the computationally it becomes harder. And so when you're doing this model space search, there are many different properties to think of, like minimality, monotonicity, and completeness. I won't really go into the details of that, but just to as a takeaway, keep in mind that now we are no longer searching in the space of states or plans as normally done in decision making. You have a model of the problem and you're searching within that model in the space of states and plans. Now we are searching in the space of models and trying to figure out which model should I take the human to in order that a given plan makes sense. And so that's what explanations. You could do the same with other forms of communication as well. So that's the other side of the coin for predictability and legibility. You could communicate parts of your model information through natural language, through GUIs, gestures. And in particular, one thing I wanted to highlight here is the use of mixed reality in these situations. Any kind of communication, you will be the goal is to make sure that you're reducing ambiguity. But one of the interesting things that we explored using mixed reality was the fact that the symbols or holograms or whatever you're using do not really need to exist in real life. So that means that in the implicit behavior that we looked at before, the robot actually pays a penalty of doing something suboptimal to communicate something implicitly. With stuff like mixed reality, the cost of doing something is minimal because it didn't really happen. And so that kind of adds a interesting flavor to what you can communicate and how much that really costs. And so that kind of completes the overall sort of landscape of what the different notions of interpretability look like and how each of them correspond to some level of communication. And you can do that interchangeably. As I said, it turns out that these do not mix well. So for example, you could think of, let's say the robot does something very convoluted and you can tell exactly what the goal is from that. So it's very legible, but that thing might not be what you were expecting. And so in general, behavior X might not also mean behavior Y. So an explicable plan may be not that legible, or a legible plan might be very inexplicable. And so individually, they might be useful for interpretability, but taken together, they do not mix well. And the reason for that is that there's no such thing as a legible agent or a explicable agent. There is only agents that can model the human in the loop, human aware agents in general. And so there is no expectation, there is no a priori expectation of the human that one of these behaviors would be incentivized in the course of an interaction. And so one of the key aspects to think about while thinking about these things together when you're designing something that is interpretable in the general sense is that there is such a model as I don't know for the human. And there's always, when you take an I don't know model into account, along with whatever your other expectations of the mental model are, it does become a case of all these three behaviors become together a case of a reasoning process over models on the part of the observer. And so one of the very recent things that we were exploring is how you can take these things together and cast this as a single reasoning process of the human. And one of the things to keep in mind there is that, as I said, there is explicit communication, there's implicit communication, and the effect of implicit communication is the same. It's actuating on the mental model of the observer. If the observer sees something, not only do these observations go to the abductive process of the observer, but also they change their model as they see more things. And so that means that when you're taking all of these together, you have to consider what the evolving mental model of the human is. And so with those considerations in mind, you can now think of these three things together, as well as think what the corresponding update to the mental model would be. Now, the obvious question is that why not do both? It's not like these things have to live separately in their individual silos. You can think of interpretability after the fact, as well as during the behavior itself. And the key question here is that is it possible to generate behavior that takes into account the explanation or communication cost after the fact? So, for example, if you want to make explicable plans versus explanations, why not make plans that are easier to explain and trade that off with the cost of explanations at the time of the behavior? And this is something that that we as humans do all the time. So if we know that we have to explain something, our decisions change a bit. If we know we are observed, our decisions change a bit. And the goal of this work was to see if we can do the same for robots in general. So if they know that they have to explain something, can they produce a plan that makes that explanation simpler? And so I will illustrate that with a small example. So here we have a robot that's doing a search and rescue task. So there's a robot that's internal to a scene, and there's some external human who is operating or providing the robot with higher level goals and evaluating how the robot is doing. So the setup is that there is an external agent in charge, but there's a robot that's internal to the scene that has much more information of what's going on the ground. And so it's a very natural case of models differing, because the external human doesn't see everything. And of course, the environment changes as the operations proceed. And so the models of the internal robot and the external human diverge over time. And here in this example, what the robot is doing is, so on the first one, it's clearing away like artificial rubble, so to speak. And the point of this illustration is that this is a costly action that the robot is taking, because it doesn't want to take a path that's not expected by the external supervisor. In the second case, the robot is taking a much shorter path, and on the top, it's explaining to the human why it's taking it in terms of the differences in the model. So the point is that it's trying to trade away what the human expects in their model versus what the current model demands. And this is a trade-off between the two notions of explicability and explanations that we saw earlier. One is that if we are producing plans that are closer to what the expectations are, we are incurring a cost of being explicable, versus if you're communicating explanations, there's a cost of explanations as well. And so we go back to this notion of model-based search and say that we no longer have an input plan to deal with. Now the task is to generate plans, but we are generating plans not just to explain, but to minimize the departure from optimality as well. And this departure is basically the cost of being explicable. So we are incurring some cost of explicability, but we are also trading that off with the cost of an explanation at the time of generating a plan. And so these are some cute properties that it can produce explanations that are even shorter than what you would have as minimal explanations after the fact. And so basically, you would plan for a thing that's the easiest to explain. And we followed up this setup with a bunch of experiments with different forms of explainers in the loop. So basically, we made a browser interface of what the external would see from what the robot is up to, and try to see how they would react to these trade-off. Of course, from the human's point of view, a balanced plan that's trading these concepts off versus an explanation-only plan doesn't make any difference, because both of them need to be explained. But from the robot's point of view, it's saving a lot of cost from either from explanations or from the departure from optimality. And so so the fact that both of the balanced plans and the optimal plans are nearby same in terms of explanation fast is good for the robot. But also in about 1/3 of the cases, the humans did ask for explanations where they shouldn't have. And in another 1/3, they didn't ask for explanations where they should have. And this sort of boils down to the fact that the mental models are not accurate. Of course, you don't know what's exactly inside the human's head. So there's always some level of inaccuracy there. And you would be off in a certain way, but at least in a giant percentage of cases, you would be able to cater to what the expectations would have been. And it sort of also depends on what the sort of, let's say, the personality of the end user is as well. Like some people are more prone to taking risks and trusting the robot, while others are not. And so you usually see a sort of a bimodal distribution in how people respond to this. But the key point here is to understand that we can look at these profiles and go back to the trade-off here and understand what the alpha in this cost function should be, depending on, let's say, a broad class of users, or depending on a particular user, we can modulate that trade-off and be more attuned to what exactly the expectations are. So that's sort of a brief overview of how these things look together. One thing I like to highlight very briefly is that there is actually a third option. So the first two that we looked at, one is from the robot's point of view, like you're changing the behavior of the robots. There is no direct communication. The second one was direct communication, so it involves some interaction with the user. The third one on environment design is purely on the developer of the system. So if there is something, is somebody who makes the robot or the environment the robot is going to work with, you can actually change the environment to make sure that certain behaviors are incentivized. As an example, let's say you walk into a room and you either go left or right. It's impossible to know which way you're going until you take a decision either way. But if you place some obstruction right in front of the door, then you have to make the decision whether to go left or right immediately. And so it's part of the way the environment designed that your intentions get resolved right at the start. And you can use things like that to incentivize any one of these or all of these behaviors together. So you could think of applications like that, especially in cases where you have more control over the environment. Let's say a warehouse where there are many robots and many humans working. You can design it so that things are more predictable from the human's point of view and so on. And fourth thing that I didn't mention till now is that there is mental modeling has both positives and negatives, so to speak. Like if you can directly model the human and their expectations, you can also mislead them using the same techniques. And one of the things that that's implicit in this model space search is that the underlying the model that's guiding this search is the ground truth model. You're always making changes to the mental model in terms of what the robot knows to be true. And you can relax that and say that I'm going to make model edits that are not, I know that are not true, but it will satisfy all the other properties. And you can use this exact same techniques to generate alternative facts, so to speak. I won't go into the details of that, but it's a very interesting line of research as well. So I would wrap up this notion of this landscape of these different kinds of behaviors by noting that we have sort of changed the traditional decision-making process here. So usually they said you have as input a model that you have to plan with, and as output, you get a plan. And in general, this doesn't have to be a planning problem. It's any decision-making problem. It could be like you're computing shortest paths, you may be computing policies, and so on. So it's a decision-making problem where given a model, you make a decision. What has changed with having humans in the loop is that you are no longer making a decision given a model. You are basically trying to figure out what's the best model to make the decision in. And so the output of such a decision-making problem is that is not only a plan or policy, but also some information on how to communicate or interact with the human in the context of that output plan or policy. So a solution comes with both the behavior as well as the a notion of how to communicate in terms of that behavior. In the final part, I will briefly touch upon some of these concepts in action. And it's been, depending on what exact domain you're working with, I usually find it very useful to look at what the user persona is and identify what the root cause of misalignment is. And so here's some examples that I've looked at before: in decision support, tutoring systems, human robot teams, domain authoring problems, smart environments. All of these have a very unique root cause of how mental models can differ from the model of the robot. And I won't go into all of these, of course, but the general takeaway is that if you are working in any domain where you're trying to look at these issues, you have to look at who the user is and understand what the differences come from. I will briefly touch upon, I think, something that will be interesting to the human-robot interaction community as well, is this idea of embodied agents as a smart agent as an example. So here's an example that I worked with a couple of years back. It's a smart room where there are a bunch of sensors. Some of these sensors might be actuated. There are robots that are part of the room, but all of these make an agent that's sort of what we call an embodied agent. The entire room is an agent. There is no single, the robot by itself is not the single agent. And one of the, I will skip over a bit and talk about, yeah, so one of the interesting bits that we were looking at in the space of this smart room was to make things more proactive and longer term in terms of how the humans and the room behaved. So we want to make sure that the robots come in a little bit more proactively and can hold longer term conversations with the humans. And so the grand goal was that the people would be doing something by themselves and they would come in to help. And there's a everlasting kumbaya between the room and the people in the room. But the reality turned out to be a bit different because the room is not a single agent like you think of humans and robots. It was very hard to tell what exactly the internal processes of the room was, what it was seeing, what it was hearing, and how those sensors and knowledge derived from those sensors and decisions made on knowledge derived from those sensors stack up to the decisions of the room. And so the kind of interactions that we got were of surprise and not smooth interaction. And so one of the things that we looked at doing in this case is to identify what again, coming back to the discussion on model differences, here the model differences align from the fact that the room has distributed sensors and listening to parts of things, seeing things that we are not seeing. And so part of addressing those misalignments is to show to the human what exactly is going on in the context of the work that they're doing. And one of the ways that we did that was to think of this idea of externalizing the brain of the agent. So sort of a stacked representation starting from what they're seeing, what they're listening, they as in the different parts of the room, and then increasingly higher up to what they are deriving from what they're listening and hearing. So what entities did it identify, who did it see, and so on. And then to higher level interactions of how to use that information and come up with the decisions. And all of that leads to the final decisions that the room is making, but the humans in the loop could go into here and at any level and see what's actually going on. And I won't go into the details of this. I think at the top of the half an hour, so I will stop here, make a detour to the end. So I'll end here and say that a lot of this work is done with collaboration from a wide range of collaborators across universities and at IBM, at ASU, and other institutions as well. And a big thank you to all of them. And if you're interested in these topics, check out the XIP workshop at XIP at ICAPS later this year. We have a very fun lineup set up there. And then most of what I discussed is in the first paper outlined here. But I noticed this new survey recently from Sebastian and Sylvia and Anna. And I thought it's a very nice read. So if you're looking more for this on this topic, take a look at that as well. I will leave you with the sort of the big takeaway is that dealing with humans in the loop involve explicit modeling of what those expectations from those end users are. And when you're modeling explicitly what those expectations are, a lot of the decision-making problems happen in the space of models. And it's depending on how you are using those models, you're trying to target different notions of interpretability, which may or may not combine together well. So it's a hard problem, but it's a necessary problem if you're dealing with end users. I'll stop here and take questions.
Thank you, Tathagata, for the interesting talk. This was super interesting for me, and I think for everyone in the crowd. So we can open up the floor for questions. Feel free to post questions in the chat, or if you want, you can just unmute yourself and ask the questions. And I'll start my question till people get warmed up for the questions and everything. So one of the questions which I have, like you kind of hinted a bit, not went into the detail of the work which you did towards the lies generation and everything. So one of the things which was discussed in the HRI conference was like lies are essential for some of the social behavior. So one of this concept is this bullshitting robots, like basically important for having the social behavior. But do you think from the planning perspective, there would be scenarios where lying would be appropriate? And what would be the justification, or what would be the background, or what would go into it to make it more feasible or justifiable?
Yeah, so well, there's a computational justification sometimes, as well as like a sort of an operational justification. So sometimes lies are easier to explain. Like it's easier to explain with a lie than with a real explanation. What is it? What was the movie? The Few Good Men. Like you can't, you want to hear the truth, you can't deal with the truth or something like that. I butchered the quote, but the idea is that sometimes the truth might be harder to explain than a lie, both from the computational point of view as well as the interaction point of view. And so you could make a case that I would just go with this small, like the easier explanation or a false explanation, just because the end user would be happy with it. I think the root question of whether to use things like that is the implications of the interaction later on. So if you make a false claim now and the human is making decisions based on that, then that's not good, because ultimately it will fall apart. And so I wouldn't, and so once things fall apart, then you have to go back and say that nobody will probably trust the robot again. So there are longer term implications beyond just one lie. And in general, one of the things that I did when I was looking at the question of lies was looking at this at use cases in between doctors and patients. Like doctors, at least used to, more than now, the practice has changed somewhat, but it was under certain circumstances, it was seen okay to hide or falsify information if that meant that the patient would recover better. That has changed over the years, precisely because of what the implications on trust are. But you could even think of like placebos as a sort of lie. And the ground reality is that in any of those cases, and there are some famous like legal cases where people look at the implications of a lie that a doctor told and it went bad after that. It always comes down to what sort of consent the patient gave to the doctor, implicitly or explicitly. And especially if you come to robots telling lies as well for some operational benefit, then it would be in the user agreement that robots can do that to avoid any repercussions on the makers of the robot later on. It's like and so at that point, the using lies kind of becomes not that useful because the human knows things might be false. So it's a very interesting topic. Yeah, I shouldn't probably spend the entire discussion talking about it, but if you're interested, we can go deeper later on.
Thank you for the answer. That was quite intriguing. So I'll go into some of the questions in the chat. So one of the questions is, would a model that tries to minimize explanation be similar to a model that tries to negotiate and arrive to the best alternative?
Yes. Well, so one of the things that I didn't really mention in any of this is the difference between execution versus planning. Like in all of the cases that I talked about, mostly the plans haven't happened yet. You have thought of doing this. What happens after that may be actual execution, or it might be negotiation. Right? So in the case of, let's say in the case of decision support examples, where the only job of the planner is to support decisions that the human is coming up with, there is a negotiation issue. So you make a plan, it's different from what the expectation is, and then you tell the user that these are the differences, this is how it should change, and so on. So it's a back and forth. Whereas if it's in a setting where, let's say, there's a robot working with a teammate, and you see that robot execute something, then it's already done. So there's nothing to execute, nothing to negotiate. But seeing that execution changes the model of the human. So let's say that the robot didn't know that the human didn't know that the robot can fly, but the robot flew, then it's already happened, and there's no reason to negotiate or explain. So sort of the answer to whether to negotiate for an alternative or to explain or to execute and let that change the model, those come after the plan has been made already. It's an interaction time consideration, but definitely it is one of those considerations.
Sounds good. Next question is from Brad, and he's asking basically, how do you choose